The debt nobody called. The alarms on Orrin Reach do not sound like alarms anywhere else I have ever served, and I have served on enough stations to know the difference. They sound almost polite, a soft rising tone that repeats 3 times and then waits, as if the station itself is giving you a chance to fix the problem quietly before it tells everyone else. I was pressed against the cold wall of a maintenance corridor when I heard it for the 3rd time that hour, and I remember thinking, with a kind of detached clarity that only comes when you have already accepted you might not walk out of a room, that whatever happened in the next 60 minutes was going to be the reason I spent the rest of my life the way I have spent it since. I did not know that yet in any way I could have explained. I only knew that my hands were shaking, and that 6 armed members of a debt crew I had shared a mess hall with for 2 years were somewhere on the other side of that wall, and that they had already sealed the reactor deck behind them. I have told this story enough times now, to enough different audiences, that I have learned which details people expect me to skip past quickly, and which ones they lean forward to hear more of. They expect me to move quickly past the fear, as though fear was simply a formality on the way to the interesting part. I have never been able to do that honestly, because the fear is not separate from what happened next. It is the whole reason what happened next mattered as much as it did. If I had not been afraid, if any of us sealed in that corridor had not genuinely believed we might not survive the hour, then what came afterward would have been nothing more than an interesting policy decision. It was not that. It was, for every one of us pressed against that wall, the realization that we were about to learn something true about the people around us, at a cost none of us had chosen and could not undo. I should tell you what Orrin Reach is, because nothing that follows will make sense otherwise. It is a joint research relay, built by my people, the Solenari, and staffed in part by a small human contingent under an old scientific exchange agreement that neither government fully trusted and both governments quietly needed. We orbit a dying star system called Corvus Ember, cataloguing a star in its last slow centuries, and the work is patient and unglamorous, and until that day, entirely without incident. I was the station's logistics coordinator, which is a polite way of saying I was the one who made sure supplies, personnel, and debt manifests all arrived where they were supposed to, on schedule, without anyone above me having to think about it twice. The morning of the mutiny began the way most mornings on Orrin Reach began, which is to say quietly, with the low hum of the recycled air system, and the particular reddish light Corvus Ember through the observation deck at that hour. A light so slow and steady in its dying that some of the human researchers had taken to calling it the Ember Glow, a phrase that had somehow made its way into our own station logs despite belonging to a language none of us had been raised speaking. I remember passing Lucia Byrne in the corridor outside the mess hall, her arms full of sensor calibration equipment, and I remember she stopped just long enough to ask whether the fresh produce shipment had come in yet, because the hydroponics bay had been rationing citrus for 3 weeks and she had apparently promised someone a specific dessert. It is strange, looking back, how ordinary that conversation was, how completely neither of us understood that we were standing in the last quiet hour either of us would have on that station for a long time. I want to say something about my own history with the ledger here, because I think it matters for understanding how deeply I believed in the system before that day forced me to look at it directly. My grandmother had been a client worker herself, 2 generations back, on a mining relay in the outer compact systems, and she had repaid her contract in full over 11 years, and she had told me, more than once, with what I always understood to be genuine pride, that the ledger was the fairest system our people had ever built, because it asked only for what was owed and nothing more. I believed her completely. I had built my entire career on believing her completely. It did not occur to me, until the message about Eothren's recalculated debt arrived on my console 2 days before the alarms, that fairness and enforceability are not always the same thing, and that a system can be built with entirely fair intentions and still, quietly, over enough years, be bent by people who benefit from bending it. I want to explain the debt manifest specifically, because they are the reason everything that follows happened at all, and because if you do not understand them, you will not understand my people. Among the Solenari, most labor crews working outside our home systems are not free citizens. They are client crews, bound to what we call the ledger, a formal debt taken on to pay for passage, training, or citizenship rights, worked off over years of contracted service under a ledger warden. It is not slavery, we are always careful to say. It is a contract, freely entered, patiently repaid. I believed that completely for most of my life, the way you believe anything you have never once been forced to question. 2 days before the alarms, a message arrived from the compact central ledger office recalculating the debt owed by our station's client crew. A group of 11 workers led by a woman named Eothren, who had kept our life support running through 2 separate equipment failures the previous winter without complaint and without being thanked properly for either. The recalculation added 4 additional years to crews that had, by every account I had personally reviewed, already worked off their original terms. It was legal. It was, according to the ledger office, simply an adjustment for interest accrued during a currency fluctuation none of them had caused and none of them had any way to appeal. I read that message 3 times before I understood what it actually meant for the 11 people it named, and I remember pulling up Eothren's original contract alongside it, laying the 2 documents side by side on my console the way I had been trained to do for any manifest discrepancy, small or large. The original terms were clear. 8 years, standard passage debt, with an interest clause that specified, in language even a first-year clerk could parse correctly, that fluctuations would be calculated against the rate on file at the time of signing, not against whatever rate happened to be convenient 8 years later. The recalculation used the later rate. It was not a mistake. Mistakes, in my experience, tend to be inconsistent, scattered, careless in a way that reveals itself under scrutiny. This was applied with perfect, deliberate consistency to exactly 3 client crews across the outer relay network, all of them nearing the end of their contracted terms, all of them representing exactly the kind of labor cost the ledger office's own quarterly reports had recently flagged as a shortfall they needed to close. I filed a formal objection through the proper channel, the way I had filed a dozen smaller objections before, and I expected the same answer I always received, which was a polite acknowledgement, and no change at all. I did not expect Eothren to walk into the reactor control room 40 hours later, with 2 of her crew and a station-issue plasma cutter repurposed into something considerably less legal. And I did not expect to find myself, along with 4 other Solenari staff, sealed into a maintenance corridor with them while the rest of the station scrambled to understand what was happening. I will tell you plainly that I was afraid, and that the fear was not really about the plasma cutter, or even about dying, though both of those things were certainly on my mind. The fear that sat underneath all of it, the one I could not name yet, was the fear of finding out that the system I had spent my whole career quietly serving might have finally shown me exactly what it was capable of doing to people who trusted it. I did not know yet that the next few hours would answer a very different question, one I had never thought to ask at all, which was what a species with no ledger, no debt logic, and total power over the people who had taken us hostage would actually choose to do with that power once they had it. Ledger logic. Eothren did not raise her voice once during the entire seizure, which I remember finding almost more unsettling than shouting would have been. She had spent 2 years being quietly, competently invisible in exactly the way client crews are trained to be, and she brought that same quiet competence to taking the reactor deck, the auxiliary control room, and 11 hostages, 5 of them Solenari station staff and 2 of them, to my genuine surprise, members of the small human science team assigned to the Reach. I had known Eothren well enough to nod to her in the corridors, to know she took her tea without sweetener, and kept a small carved figure of some animal from her homeworld clipped to her tool belt, but I had never once had a conversation with her that lasted longer than a work order required, and I think that fact alone says something true about how invisible client crews are trained to become. When she came through the maintenance hatch with the plasma cutter in hand, she looked at me directly, and I remember she said my name before she said anything else, as though she wanted me to understand that this was not impersonal, that she knew exactly whose corridor she was standing in. Coordinator Vantral, she said, I am sorry for this. I filed my objection through you because you were the only one who answered honestly instead of with a form letter. I am not doing this because I think you failed me. I am doing it because nobody above you was ever going to answer at all. I did not know what to say to that, and I still do not know, even now, whether anything I could have said would have mattered. What I remember most clearly is that her crew moved through the seizure without a single wasted motion, without a single raised weapon pointed anywhere it did not need to be, and that when one of the younger hostages, a Solenari Records clerk barely out of his training years, began to hyperventilate against the corridor wall, it was one of Eo's own crew, a broad-shouldered man named Petrichol, who knelt down beside him and talked him through slow, even breaths in the same patient voice he must have once used teaching someone to read a pressure gauge. It was the strangest hostage crisis I have ever been part of, in that everyone inside it seemed to be trying, in their own way, to keep everyone else from being hurt more than the situation already required. I remember, too, a smaller moment that I did not understand the significance of until much later. One of Eo's crew, a wiry young woman named Sailor Brock, who could not have been more than a year or two out of her own training contract, spent the first 20 minutes of the standoff apologizing, quietly and repeatedly, to no one in particular, as though the words simply needed somewhere to go. I heard her say, at one point, that she had not wanted it to come to this, that she had asked Eo twice whether there was another way, and that Eo had told her there wasn't, not anymore, not after the third appeal had been denied without so much as a formal response. I mention this because it would be easy, telling this story quickly, to make Eo Thren's crew sound like people who chose violence casually. They did not. Every one of them I spoke to afterward described the seizure not as a plan they were proud of, but as the last door left standing open after every other door had been quietly, patiently closed on them for 2 years. I asked Sailor Brock, much later, once the immediate danger had passed and I had begun keeping my own private record of everything I had witnessed, whether she had been afraid during the seizure itself. She told me she had been more afraid before it than during it, because before it there had still been the possibility that nothing would change, that the recalculated debt would simply stand, and she would spend 4 more years of her life paying for a mistake that was never hers to begin with. Once the seizure had actually begun, she said, at least the waiting was over, and waiting, she told me, was always the part that frightened her most. I had not expected the human contingent to end up among the hostages at all. Their quarters were on the opposite side of the station from the reactor deck, and I learned later that the two who were caught, a young systems technician named Lucia Byrne, and an older maintenance specialist, had simply been in the wrong corridor, at the wrong shift change, checking a sensor calibration that had nothing to do with any of this. Lucia did not look afraid in the way I expected a hostage to look. She looked, more than anything, like someone doing careful math in her head, watching the exits, watching Eo Thren's crew, watching all of us with an attention that had nothing performative about it. The station's response in those first minutes was chaos wearing the mask of procedure, every department head speaking over every other department head on the emergency channel, until Warden Corin's voice cut through all of it with the flat, practiced authority of someone who had drilled for this exact scenario 100 times in simulation, and never once expected to need it for real. She ordered the station sealed into isolated sections, the human contingent's quarters included, and she ordered every off-duty Solenari staff member to report to the secondary command deck, which is how I found myself, along with 4 colleagues I barely knew outside our shared shift rotations, sealed into a maintenance corridor adjacent to the reactor deck instead of somewhere safer, simply because that was where the isolation protocol happened to catch us when the doors began closing. Eo's demand, once she finally stated it over the station's internal channel, was simple enough that even the ledger office would have understood it instantly, whatever they chose to do about it. She wanted the recalculated debt reversed, in writing, verified by an authority outside the ledger office itself, before she released the reactor controls or anyone in that corridor. She was not asking for freedom outright. She was asking, essentially, for the contract to be honored as it had originally been written, nothing more, nothing less, and I remember thinking even then, frightened as I was, that there was something almost unbearably reasonable about a hostage demand that simply asked for the paperwork to be true. The station's ranking Solenari officer, a warden named Ilsa Corin, response was immediate, and, by every standard of our culture, entirely correct. She ordered the reactor deck's environmental controls locked down from the outside, cutting off EO's crew's ability to vent or flood any section beyond the one they already held, and she began quietly preparing what she called a containment resolution, which is a phrase our military uses when it does not want to say the word it actually means. It was at this point that Myra Okafor, the human station commander, requested access to the same control interface Warden Corin was using, and I want to be honest that my first assumption, shaped by every piece of cultural instinct I possessed, was that she wanted it for exactly the same reason. Among my people, whoever holds decisive leverage in a crisis uses it as fully and as quickly as possible, because leverage you do not use is assumed, almost as a matter of grammar, to be leverage you are lying about having. Myra's team controlled the station's primary power distribution grid under the exchange agreement's original terms, which meant that with a single authorization, she could cut all life support to the reactor deck and end the standoff in under 4 minutes, with EO3's crew almost certainly dead before any rescue effort could reach them. I remember watching her review that authorization on her console from where I sat pressed against the corridor wall, close enough to see the screen through the open hatch, and I remember the strange, suspended silence in that corridor while every Solenara present, myself included, waited for the only outcome any of us had ever been trained to expect. The section that could kill them. Myra Okafor did not authorize the shutdown. Instead, she opened a direct channel to the reactor deck and asked to speak to EO3 personally, which was, in itself, already outside anything Warden Corin's own protocol described, and I watched the warden's expression shift from controlled patience into something closer to genuine confusion, the specific kind that comes from watching someone with clear tactical superiority decline to use it for reasons that make no immediate sense. I need to describe what I understood at that moment about how power is supposed to work, because otherwise you will not understand why what happened next felt, to me, less like relief, and more like watching the floor of the universe quietly rearrange itself. Among the Solenari, and among nearly every species I had studied in my logistics training, an actor holding decisive leverage in a hostage situation, who does not use it is assumed to be doing one of two things. Either they are weak, unwilling or unable to make a hard decision when it is required of them, which invites further exploitation. Or they are laying a trap of some kind, a delay meant to buy time for a worse outcome later, which invites suspicion and, usually, a preemptive strike to remove the advantage before it can be sprung. There is no third category in ledger logic. There is no cultural slot for a party who simply chooses, deliberately, with full understanding of the cost, not to use power it is entitled to use. Myra's voice, when it came through the shared channel, was calm in a way that did not sound rehearsed. She told EO3 plainly that she had the authority to cut life support to the reactor deck within minutes, that she understood exactly what that authority meant, and that she was choosing not to exercise it, not as a negotiating tactic, but because she did not believe 11 desperate people asking for an honest contract deserved to die for making that request in the wrong way. She said she wanted to talk instead. Warden Corin, beside me, said something under her breath that I will not translate exactly, but the meaning of it was close to, "She is lying, she must be lying, no one holds a knife like that and simply sets it down." I understood the sentiment completely, because I shared it in that moment as fully as she did. I had spent my entire adult life inside a system where restraint under power was, at absolute best, a rare and celebrated exception written into philosophy texts, and at worst a naive miscalculation that got the restrained party killed by someone less sentimental. I did not expect Myra Okafor's restraint to be real. I expected it to be a delay, and I braced, along with every other Solenari in that corridor, for whatever the delay was actually hiding. I want to describe Warden Corin a little more fully here, because it would be easy to make her sound like a villain in this story, and she was never that. She was a career officer who had spent 30 years believing, with good reason, that hesitation in a crisis gets people killed, and that belief had served her well enough, often enough, that questioning it in the middle of an active hostage situation was simply not a reasonable thing to ask of her. She looked at Myra's decision not as cruelty withheld, but as a gamble made with other people's lives, ours included, and I understood, even as I found myself hoping Myra was right, that Warden Corrin's fear was not unreasonable. It was simply built on the only model either of us had ever been given. Thomas Reyes, Myra's second-in-command, remained on the bridge throughout this exchange, and I learned only afterward that he had quietly prepared a full tactical override in parallel with Myra's negotiation, not because he distrusted her judgment, but because he told me later that good commanders always keep a second option ready, even one they never intend to use, so that restraint is a choice made freely, and not a trap sprung by having no other move available. I found that detail oddly reassuring once I learned it, because it meant Myra's mercy had not been born from an absence of power at all. It had been chosen deliberately, with a fully loaded alternative sitting untouched at her side the entire time. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room full of people waiting for a decision they cannot influence, and I do not think I had ever experienced it as fully as I did in that corridor. It is not the silence of calm. It is the silence of everyone present doing the same private arithmetic at once, weighing what they know against what they fear, and arriving, over and over, at answers they do not want to say aloud in case saying them makes the wrong outcome more likely. I remember Warden Corrin's hand hovering near her own sidearm, without ever quite touching it, and I remember the records clerk beside me murmuring something under his breath that I recognized, after a moment, as a phrase from the ledger oath every Solenari child learns before they are old enough to understand what a contract is. What is owed will be repaid. I did not know, in that moment, whether he meant it as comfort or as warning. Lucia Byrne, still seated on the floor of the corridor with the rest of us, spoke quietly to me while we waited, and I remember her words more clearly than almost anything else from that day. "She's not hiding anything," Lucia said. "She's just doing the thing we are taught to do first, before force. You try the door before you break it down." I told her, honestly, that where I came from, trying the door first was generally understood to mean you did not actually have the strength to break it down at all. Lucia looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression was not offended exactly, but genuinely surprised, as if I had described a belief so foreign to her that she needed a second to process that I meant it sincerely. She was quiet for a moment after that, and then she said something that surprised me even more than her surprise had. She said, "My grandmother used to say the same thing about hesitation, actually, that it was weakness dressed up as patience." And then she watched my father spend 6 years arguing a wrongful debt case for a neighbor who couldn't afford a lawyer, arguing it slowly, patiently, the long way, when he could have just paid it off himself in an afternoon and been done with it. My grandmother thought he was a fool for it. I asked Lucia what had happened to the case. She smiled, briefly, the first real smile I saw from any of the humans that day, and said, "He won it. Took 6 years, but the ruling changed the law for everyone after, not just the one neighbor." She said trying the door first only looks like weakness, if you're only watching the first try. I did not fully understand what she meant in that moment, pressed against a cold wall with a plasma cutter somewhere on the other side of it, but I found myself thinking about it again and again in the months that followed, long after the reactor deck had been repainted and the story had become something people told rather than something they lived through. The open hand. What followed over the next 90 minutes was not the negotiation I expected, and I want to describe it carefully, because it is the entire hinge on which everything afterward turned. Myra did not offer Eothren freedom, because that was never within her authority to give. What she offered instead was smaller and, I would come to understand, far more consequential. She offered to personally verify the debt recalculation against the original contract records, using the Human Science Team's independent data archive, which was not subject to Ledger Office jurisdiction, and could not be quietly altered the way our own records theoretically could. She offered to release that verification publicly, on an open channel, regardless of what it showed. And she offered, if the recalculation proved false, which she suspected it would, to help Eothren's crew reach a jurisdiction where the original ledger office could not simply revise the numbers again once this crisis had ended and everyone's attention had moved elsewhere. I watched Warden Corin's face while this offer was being made, and I watched it settle into an expression I had never seen on her before. A kind of stunned stillness, because Myra was doing something that had no clean equivalent in ledger logic at all. She was not exploiting the crisis to gain advantage over Eothren. She was not using her leverage to force a surrender. She was using her leverage, the very thing that could have ended the standoff in 4 minutes with everyone in that reactor deck dead, to instead confirm whether the hostage-takers had actually been telling the truth, and to help them if they had been. Eothren did not surrender immediately, and I do not think that hesitation reflects poorly on her at all. She had spent 2 years inside a system that had taught her, as thoroughly as it had taught me, that an offer this generous, made by someone holding this much power, could only be a more sophisticated trap than the obvious one. She asked Myra directly what she wanted in exchange, because among my people, an unconditional offer is definitionally impossible. A category error, like asking someone to describe the color of silence. Myra's answer was the one I have thought about most often since, more even than the outcome that followed. She said she wanted nothing in exchange beyond the truth being confirmed either way, and she said that if EO's crew chose to stand down, she was not going to pretend the takeover had not happened, or that there would be no consequences at all within our own system. But she was not going to be the reason 11 people died for trying to get an honest answer about their own contract, when getting that answer honestly should never have required this in the first place. The 40 minutes it took to run that verification were, I think, the longest 40 minutes of my life up to that point, and I remember them less as a stretch of time than as a series of small, disconnected details. The sound of the auxiliary generator cycling somewhere below us. The records clerk, Carmenal, quietly thanking Patrick Yole for talking him through the breathing, and Patrick telling him, gruffly, not to mention it, that he had 4 children of his own back home, and had done this exact thing more times than he could count. Warden Corin pacing a tight, controlled circle near the sealed hatch, checking her own authorization console every few minutes, as though she expected Myra's offer to quietly evaporate the longer it went unused. And Lucia Byrne, beside me, humming something low and tuneless under her breath. A habit she told me afterward she had picked up from her father, who used to hum while waiting on court rulings, because silence made the waiting worse and singing made it look like you weren't taking it seriously enough. When the confirmation finally came through, verified and broadcast exactly as Myra had promised, I watched Eothren's face on the shared monitor, and I watched something in it that I can only describe as a person setting down a weight she had been braced to carry for a very long time. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded once, said something quiet to her crew that the channel did not carry clearly, and began, without any further instruction from anyone, walking her people out of the reactor deck with their weapons already disengaged and set down on the deck plating behind them. EO released the reactor deck without further incident once the confirmation was public, and Myra, true to what she had said, quietly arranged for her crew to be transferred, under an existing labor mobility clause almost nobody used, to a relay called Haldane's Rest, at the far edge of the joint exchange zone, where human oversight handled contract disputes directly, and the ledger office had no standing authority to revise the numbers again once attention had moved elsewhere. It was not amnesty. It was not forgiveness of a crime. It was, simply, the thing she had promised, delivered exactly as promised, with nothing extracted in return beyond the truth itself. I learned, much later, that Eothren still works at Haldane's Rest today, no longer under any ledger contract at all, training new arrivals in exactly the careful, unglamorous competence that had once kept our station's life support running through 2 separate failures nobody properly thanked her for. I want to describe one more exchange from that day, because it is the one I return to most often when I try to explain to other Solenari why I believe what I believe. Before Eothren's crew left the reactor deck, she asked to speak with Myra directly, in person rather than over the channel, and Myra agreed without hesitation, walking into the very section she had just spent 90 minutes choosing not to depressurize. I watched this exchange from a short distance, close enough to hear it. Io asked Myra, plainly, why she had actually done it, since Myra had gained nothing material from the choice at all. Myra thought about the question for a moment before answering, and then she said that where she came from, they had a saying about how you find out what people actually value by looking at what they do when no one can force them to do otherwise. She said she had spent her whole career trying to be someone worth that saying, and she was not about to stop the one time it actually mattered. Io did not respond to that immediately. She simply looked at Myra for a long moment, the way I imagine a person looks at something they have been told does not exist and are now holding in their own hands. I filed my own account of what happened that day into a private record I did not share with anyone, the same way, I would later learn, station commanders on a dozen other joint outposts had quietly begun doing the same thing after hearing what had happened on Orin Reach. Because word of it did travel, slowly at first, through exactly the channels the Ledger officers least wanted it to travel through, among client crews who had spent their whole working lives believing, as I once had, that power unused could only ever be a lie. The Assembly hears only the danger. I did not expect the story of one small hostage crisis on a research relay near a dying star to reach the Trade Assembly at all, and for the first few months afterward, it did not. What reached the Assembly instead, slowly, quietly, through channels no single government controlled, was something the Ledger officers found far more alarming than a single mutiny. Client crews on 3 other joint stations, having heard some version of what happened at Orin Reach, began independently testing the same theory. They filed disputes. They asked questions they had never dared ask before. And in a handful of cases where human oversight was involved even peripherally, those disputes were resolved honestly, without punishment for having asked. The Assembly convened a formal session 8 months after the mutiny, and I attended as Orin Reach's ranking logistics officer, expecting to give routine testimony about the incident's operational details. I did not expect to find myself standing before 900 delegates, while Speaker Calix Doon read aloud a proposal that had clearly been drafted long before I ever entered the chamber, a proposal called the Closure Accord, which stated, in language stripped of any softness, that the human presence in joint Solenari systems represented a destabilizing influence too dangerous to permit any further expansion of, and recommended a coordinated withdrawal of all exchange agreements, backed by force if the human governments declined to comply peacefully. I want to explain why a species offering mercy terrified the Assembly more than a species offering violence would have, because I did not understand it myself until I heard the arguments made aloud in that chamber. A threat with a clear shape can be measured, counted, prepared for. A species that holds total power over you and simply declines to use it cannot be measured at all, because there is no way to calculate what it actually wants. And a dead economy that has run for 6 centuries on the assumption that every actor eventually exploits every advantage they hold cannot survive contact with an actor who provably does not. It was not, in the end, humanity's strength the Assembly feared most. It was the fact that thousands of client crews across dozens of systems had begun to believe, for the first time in their lives, that mercy might be real, and a belief like that, once it takes root, cannot be walled off or contained the way a fleet can. Speaker Doon asked me directly, as the officer who had been present, whether I believed the human commander's mercy at Orin Reach had been genuine or strategic. I told the chamber the truth, which was that I had spent 8 months trying to find the trap in it, and had not found one, that Mara Okafor had asked for nothing, gained nothing materially, and had simply done the thing she said she would do. A delegate from the Ashdeep Clade asked, not unkindly, whether I understood that my testimony, if believed, made the danger worse rather than better, because a species capable of genuine, costless restraint was a species capable of anything, and no one in that chamber could predict what anything actually meant. A representative of the Quenna household spoke next, and her argument was, I think, the most carefully reasoned one made against me that day, which is precisely why it troubled me most. She said that every stable economy the Assembly had ever built rested on predictable incentive, that a ledger office could plan around greed, around fear, around ambition, because all of those things pointed in directions that could be modeled and managed. What it could not plan around, she said, was an actor who acted against its own immediate interest for reasons that could not be priced. She said that was not a compliment to the human species. It was, in her words, the precise shape of an unmanageable variable, and an assembly built on 6 centuries of careful modeling could not afford to leave a variable like that unaddressed at its border. A younger delegate from a small trade cluster near the outer relay systems, whose name I never caught over the chamber's shifting acoustics, asked me a question none of the senior delegates had bothered to ask, which was simply what I thought would happen if the accord passed, and I turned out to be right about the humans anyway. I told him I did not know, and that this was, in its own way, the most honest answer I could give, because I had spent 8 months trying to imagine what a species capable of that kind of restraint would do when faced with 900 empires voting for its destruction, and I had not been able to picture it clearly. What I told him instead was that I trusted the shape of the pattern I had witnessed enough to believe it would not be cruelty for cruelty's sake, whatever it turned out to be, and that this, too, unsettled the chamber more than a threat would have, because a species that could not be counted on to retaliate in kind was, once again, a variable no one in that room had a name for. I asked, when it was my turn to respond more fully, whether anyone present had considered that the variable in question might simply be trustworthy, and that the difficulty the chamber was describing was not that humans could not be modeled, but that our own model had no honest category for a promise that gets kept regardless of whether anyone is watching to enforce it. Only one delegate answered me directly, an elder representative of the Abrun scholars, whose entire philosophical tradition was built around patience and restraint in a way I had always assumed made them my natural allies in that room. She said, gently, that she believed every word of my testimony, and that belief was exactly why her delegation would still be signing the accord, because a species this dangerously good at keeping its word was, in her judgment, the single hardest kind of danger to prepare a defense against. I have thought about her answer more than almost anything else said in that chamber, because I understood, even as she said it, that she was not being cruel. She was afraid, in the particular way that people who have spent their whole lives valuing patience become afraid of anything that might prove patience was never actually rare at all, just rarely offered a fair chance to be tested. Before the roll was called, Speaker Doon turned to me one final time and asked, in a tone that I believe was genuinely intended as a kindness rather than a threat, whether I understood that a single unlit seat in that chamber would not stop the accord from passing, that my refusal would change nothing about the outcome and would cost me everything about my career and my standing within the compact. I told him I understood completely, and that I had thought about exactly that trade for 8 months since the mutiny, and that I had decided a vote that changes nothing is still worth casting honestly, because the alternative was voting against something I had watched with my own eyes simply because agreeing would be easier. I refused to endorse the closure accord when the vote came, the only delegate present with direct testimony who did so, and I watched the board above the chamber fill, name by name, with the gold light of near-unanimous agreement, while my own seat remained the only unlit one left in the room by the time the roll had finished. I remember the particular quality of that silence afterward, 900 delegates all carefully not looking directly at the one dark seat among them, the way a room looks away from something it has decided is easier not to examine too closely. The channel that shouldn't exist. The weeks after the vote were quieter than I expected punishment to be, and I understand now that the quiet was its own kind of message. I was not disciplined formally. I was simply removed, gradually and without explanation, from every briefing that mattered. My clearance narrowed one small revocation at a time until I was, in practical terms, a logistics officer with nothing left to coordinate. Warden Corin, who had stood beside me in that corridor during the mutiny and watched the same thing I had watched, would not meet my eyes in the station corridors afterward, though I noticed she never spoke against me publicly either, which I understood, in its own quiet way, as a kindness she could not afford to make any louder. Yevathist, a communications officer I had trained alongside years earlier, came to my quarters on the 9th night after the vote and asked me one question I had been asking myself every night since the chamber went dark around my seat. She asked whether I actually believed what I had told the assembly, or whether I had simply said the only interesting thing left to say in a room that had already decided everything. I told her I believed it completely, that I had watched it happen with my own eyes on the reactor deck, and that nothing about the vote had changed a single fact of what I had witnessed. She told me, then, that belief without action was just a private comfort, and that if the closure accord fleets were going to move regardless of what I had said in that chamber, there was exactly one thing left worth doing before they did. I asked her, before she left my quarters that night, why she had come to ask me the question at all, rather than simply staying uninvolved the way so many of our colleagues already had. She told me that she had spent the 8 months since the mutiny listening to people describe what I had done in the chamber as either heroic or foolish, always one or the other, and that both descriptions had bothered her equally, because both of them treated it as something already finished, the story with its ending already written, when in fact nothing about it was finished at all. She said she had not come to tell me what to do next. She had come because she was tired of watching people talk about the ending of a story that was, as far as she could tell, still very much being decided. She did not stay long after that, and she did not tell me what she thought I should actually do, which I understood, later, as its own kind of protection. If she had told me directly, and it had gone wrong, she would have been complicit in a way that could have cost her everything. By leaving the decision entirely mine, she gave me the only gift she safely could, which was a single, pointed question, and enough silence afterward for me to sit with it honestly instead of arguing myself out of it. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my quarters running the same calculation over and over, the practical one, the one that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with consequence, and I kept arriving at the same uncomfortable answer, which was that I had already made this decision the moment I told the truth in that chamber, and that everything since had simply been me pretending there was still a version of my life where I could take it back. I found, buried in old station records that predated even my own posting, a private frequency the human science team had used during the mutiny to coordinate with their own oversight office, a channel that had never been properly logged because no one had thought, at the time, that logging it mattered. I used it to send a short message to the only human contact whose name I had any confidence would reach someone with real authority, a liaison named Priya, who I had learned, secondhand, through Lucia Byrne, held a position that made her one of a small number of people able to act on a message like mine without triggering a formal diplomatic incident of her own. I drafted that message more times than I am willing to admit, deleting each version before I could talk myself into sending it. I want to be honest that the version I finally sent was shorter than any of my earlier drafts, because every additional sentence I added felt like another opportunity to explain myself out of doing it at all. What I sent, in the end, said only that I had watched what happened at Orrin Reach with my own eyes, that I believed it completely, that I could not stop the closure accord from moving, but that I could offer a place with no official standing and no guarantee attached to it, and that I understood if it was refused, but I would rather offer it and be wrong than say nothing and spend the rest of my life wondering whether it might have mattered. I did not warn her that the closure fleets were coming, because I suspected, correctly, that human intelligence already knew that much on their own. What I sent instead was a promise, and a set of coordinates, a quiet, unremarkable relay system at the edge of Solenari's space that no assembly mobilization plan I had access to listed as strategically relevant, and a statement that any client crew choosing to walk away from a closure fleet rather than crew it would find shelter there for as long as I remained able to provide it. The reply came 4 days later, shorter than my own message had been. It said simply that the coordinates were noted, that the offer would be shared quietly with exactly the people who most needed to hear it, and that it would not be forgotten who had sent it. It was signed only with Priya Nakamura's name, and I sat with that reply for a long time afterward, understanding fully, for the first time, exactly how far outside the boundaries of my own government I had now placed myself, and finding, to my genuine surprise, that I did not regret it at all. Those 4 days of waiting were, in their own quiet way, harder than the mutiny itself had been. During the mutiny, there had been no decision left for me to make, only a situation to survive. Waiting for that reply, I had made the decision entirely on my own, with no one to share the responsibility of it, and no way to know whether the frequency I had used was even still monitored, whether it had been quietly decommissioned years ago, whether my message had simply drifted, unheard, into whatever silent swallows signals that arrive at an address no one is listening to anymore. I did not sleep well during those 4 days. I found myself checking the channel obsessively, at hours no reasonable person checks anything, and I remember the specific, almost physical relief of seeing the reply finally arrive, a relief that had less to do with what the message said and more to do with simply knowing, at last, that I had not shouted into an empty room. All is lost. The closure fleets mobilized 11 weeks after the vote, and I want to be clear that what happened next was not a war, not in any sense the Assembly's own strategists had prepared for. It began instead as a series of small, individually unremarkable absences. A client crew assigned to a closure vessel in the Verge cluster failed to report for departure, their transport found empty at dock, no violence, no message, simply gone. Within days, 2 more crews on separate vessels did the same. Ledger wardens across a dozen systems began reporting what they initially described as isolated discipline failures, and it took the Assembly's own analysts far longer than it should have to recognize the pattern, because the pattern was not sabotage or mutiny in any form their doctrine had a name for. It was simply thousands of people, quietly, individually, choosing not to show up for a war built on the belief that mercy could not be real, once they had finally been given somewhere real to go instead. I learned the details of one of these departures much later, from Yeva Thist, who had, by then, quietly become one of the people relaying word of the Haldane's rest coordinates through channels of her own that I never asked her to name. A woman named Deciman, a navigator on one of the closure vessels assigned to the Verge cluster fleet, had 11 years remaining on a debt contract she had never once questioned aloud, not because she believed it was fair, Yeva told me, but because questioning it had simply never seemed like a real option available to her. She left 2 nights before her vessel's scheduled departure, taking nothing but a single travel bag, and the note she left behind for the warden overseeing her contract said only that she had heard the story about the reactor deck at Orin Reach from 3 different people, who had no reason to agree on a lie, and that she had decided she would rather test whether it was true than spend 11 more years assuming it wasn't. The warden who found that note, according to Yeva, kept it, and showed it privately to at least 2 colleagues before it was ever reported up any official channel, because he said it was the first time in his career anyone had ever explained a desertion to him in words that made him ashamed rather than angry. The Assembly, to its credit, tried a great many things to slow what was happening once the pattern became undeniable. Ledger officers offered debt forgiveness incentives to crews who remained. Wardens were instructed to increase surveillance on communications suspected of relaying the Haldane's rest coordinates. None of it worked, not because the countermeasures were poorly designed, but because they were all built on the same flawed assumption that had governed everything else in this story, which was that people only ever act from fear or advantage, and that a rumor of mercy could therefore always be outbid by a sufficiently large threat, or a sufficiently generous bribe. What the Assembly could not offer, no matter how large the incentive grew, was proof, and proof, once it exists in enough hands passing it quietly from person to person, cannot be recalled the way a fleet order can. I remember one particular countermeasure the Ledger office attempted, because it revealed, more clearly than anything else, exactly how poorly the Assembly understood what it was actually up against. A formal bulletin was distributed across every client crew berth in the mobilized fleets, describing the Haldane's rest coordinates as a fabricated trap, a lure designed by human intelligence to identify and eliminate deserters before they could reach safety. It was a reasonable strategy, on paper, aimed precisely at the fear a Ledger logic culture would expect to work. The difficulty was that by the time the bulletin was distributed, enough crews had already reached Haldane's rest and sent word back through the same quiet channels that the trap explanation simply did not match what people were hearing from those who had actually gone. A rumor built on fear cannot survive contact with a growing number of people who have tested the alternative and found it true. Within 2 more weeks, the bulletin itself had become, among client crews, something close to a joke, proof not of danger but of how frightened the Ledger office had become. I was arrested during this same period, formally this time, charged with unauthorized contact with a hostile power, and named specifically in connection with the coordinates the deserting crews had begun using. I stood before a closed tribunal, 3 assembly-appointed magistrates seated across a narrow table, and I did not deny anything. I told them precisely what I had sent, and precisely why, and I told them that I understood the charge, and would answer for it honestly rather than survive it by lying. The lead magistrate, a stern, unhurried man whose name I never learned, asked me whether I understood that my actions had directly contributed to the operational collapse of a lawfully mobilized assembly fleet. I told him I understood that my actions had given several thousand people somewhere honest to go instead of a war they had never chosen, and that if the fleet's collapse was the result of that, I considered it a fair trade for my own future, whatever the tribunal decided that future would be. He asked, with what I think was genuine curiosity rather than hostility, whether I had expected this outcome when I sent the first message. I told him the truth, which was that I had expected nothing at all, only that I had made a promise on a channel that officially did not exist, and that I had learned, from watching a woman named Myra Okafor keep a promise with far more to lose than I had, that a promise only means something if you keep it regardless of what it costs you afterward. A second magistrate, younger than the first and noticeably less certain of the questions she was asking, wanted to know whether I believed my actions had weakened the Solenari Compact's standing among the other signatory empires. I told her honestly that I did not know, and that I suspected the answer depended entirely on what those empires eventually decided the Compact's standing was actually worth measuring by. If it was measured by unity of fear, then yes, I had almost certainly weakened it. But if it was ever going to be measured by whether the Compact could produce even one officer willing to tell the truth at personal cost, then perhaps, in a way none of us could yet see clearly, I had done the opposite. She did not respond to that, but she wrote something down on the record in front of her, longer than the answer alone seemed to warrant, and I have always wondered what it was. Warden Ilse Corin, called as a witness against me, testified only to the events of the mutiny itself, describing exactly what she had seen on that reactor deck. And though she offered no defense of what I had done afterward, she offered no exaggeration of it either. And I understood that restraint, coming from her, as its own quiet act of loyalty she could not afford to name. When the magistrates asked her directly whether, in her professional judgment, the human commander's mercy at Orrin Reach had been strategic, she paused for a long moment before answering, longer than I think she meant to, and then said only that in 22 years of service, she had never once seen an act of restraint that costly performed for an audience that wasn't there yet to see it, and she did not know what else to call that except sincere. The tribunal did not conclude that week. It was suspended, unresolved, as reports of the desertions grew too large to keep separate from the larger question of whether the closure accord could function at all with a growing fraction of its labor force choosing exile over compliance. I remember sitting in a detention cell on the Compact's home station, no formal sentence yet passed against me, listening to second-hand fragments of news carried in by guards who did not know I was the reason any of it had started, and feeling, for the first time since the vote, something close to true despair. I had believed that telling the truth honestly and paying my own debt to the people I had promised shelter to would be enough. It did not feel, in that cell, like it had been enough at all. It felt like I had simply handed the assembly one more name to add to a list of people it intended, eventually, to make an example of. The door that stayed open. I want to pause here and describe the day the news of the suspension actually reached Orrin Reach, because it did not arrive the way I imagine it might in a story told for effect, with cheering crowds or dramatic broadcasts. It arrived the way most real news arrives on a working station, folded into an ordinary shift briefing, mentioned almost in passing by a communications officer reading down a list of routine updates before the operational schedule for the week. I remember Lucia Byrne stopping mid-sentence when she heard it, setting down the calibration tool she had been holding, and simply standing still for a long moment in the middle of the corridor, the same corridor where the mutiny had begun, before she asked, quietly, whether that meant what she thought it meant. I told her I believed it did. She did not celebrate either, not really. She just exhaled, long and slow, the particular breath of someone who had been holding tension in her shoulders for so long she had stopped noticing it was there. The closure accord did not collapse through any single decisive event, and I think that is worth saying plainly, because the truth is less dramatic and more durable than the story would be if I simplified it. It collapsed because an economy built for 6 centuries on the assumption that every advantage would eventually be exploited could not survive contact with proof that exploitation was optional. And once enough people believed that proof, no fleet order, and no tribunal, mine included, could compel them back into a system they no longer trusted. By the time the Assembly reconvened to formally address what it euphemistically called labor instability, nearly a third of the mobilized closure fleets had lost enough crew to desertion that further deployment was, by any honest military assessment, no longer viable. Speaker Calix Doon, who had read the closure accord aloud to that chamber with such certainty months earlier, was the one who moved to suspend it, not through any change of heart I could confirm, but because a policy that could no longer be enforced was, in practical terms, no longer a policy at all. My own tribunal was quietly closed without further proceeding shortly afterward. In the same manner, so many uncomfortable questions are closed among my people, through silence rather than resolution. And I understood, walking out of that detention station a free officer with no formal record of wrongdoing attached to my name, that the silence this time was not concealment. It was, as close as my government was capable of coming, an apology it did not know how to say aloud. I want to be honest that I did not feel triumphant walking out of that station, though I think a version of this story told differently might expect me to. What I felt was closer to exhaustion, the particular kind that comes after holding your position through months of quiet isolation, never quite sure whether you were being brave or simply stubborn in a way that happened to work out. Warden Ilse Corin was waiting outside the detention block when I emerged, which surprised me more than almost anything else that day. She did not apologize, and I did not expect her to, but she walked with me back toward the transport bay in silence for a while before she said, quietly, that she had spent the last several months trying to decide whether I had been reckless or right, and that she still was not entirely sure there was a meaningful difference between the two, in the end, only that one of them happened to work. I was named, some months later, to a newly created position with no clean precedent in Solenari diplomatic history, an envoy tasked with formal liaison to the Human Science Exchange, precisely because I was, by that point, the only Solenari officer both governments still trusted to say what she actually believed rather than what was comfortable to say. I met Myra Okafor again for the first time since the mutiny at Orrin Reach itself, the sense station, the same reactor corridor, now quietly repaired and repainted, and she asked me, without any formality at all, whether I still believed what I had told that tribunal. I told her I believed it more now than I had the day I first said it, because I had watched an entire economy built on the impossibility of mercy come apart the moment enough people were finally shown it was real. She laughed, quietly, when I said that, and told me I made it sound far more dramatic than it had felt from her side of things. She said she had simply done the ordinary version of her job that day, the version she had been trained to reach for first, and that she still found it strange, faintly amusing even, that an entire interstellar labor economy had apparently been standing on a foundation that couldn't survive one station commander trying the door before breaking it down. I told her that where I came from, trying the door first had always been understood as a kind of weakness, and she looked at me for a moment, the same way Lucia Byrne once had, and said, "Well, now you know better. And I'll buy you that drink you still owe me for putting me through the worst afternoon of my career." Lucia Byrne joined us not long after, older now, running her own systems team on the Reach, and she brought with her a small dish of something involving the citrus that had finally, after all these years, arrived in reliable shipments, and I remember sitting with the two of them in the observation deck, watching the same slow ember glow I had watched the morning of the mutiny, and thinking that I finally understood what Lucia had meant, all that time ago, pressed against a cold corridor wall. About hesitation only looking like weakness, if you were only watching the first try. Thomas Reyes stopped by briefly as well, still Myra's second, though he told me, with the dry amusement of someone who had earned the right to complain a little, that his tactical override plans had gathered an embarrassing amount of dust since that day, since apparently word had spread widely enough now that station commanders across the exchange zone had started reaching for the open hand first as a matter of course, not an exception. He said it half as a joke, but I understood, underneath it, that he was describing something genuinely remarkable. A habit of restraint that had quietly become ordinary practice in a part of the galaxy where, only a few years earlier, it would have been considered either naive or suicidal to attempt at all. I asked Myra, before I left the Reach that day, whether she ever thought about what would have happened if the verification had come back the other way, if Eothren's claim had turned out to be false. She thought about it for a long moment before answering, and then she said that she had asked herself the same question many times since, and that the honest answer was she did not know, only that she believed the offer itself needed to be made in good faith regardless of what the answer turned out to be, because an offer made contingent on being proven right in advance was never really an offer of trust at all. I think about that answer often, more than almost anything else she has ever told me, because it is, I believe, the truest description I have ever heard of what made that single choice on the reactor deck so difficult to imitate, and so impossible, in the end, for an entire economy of careful calculation to withstand. I think often about the version of myself who sat in that corridor, certain that whatever came next would be the worst thing I had ever witnessed, and I think about how wrong I was, not because nothing terrible happened afterward, because plenty did, but because the worst thing I witnessed that day was not a threat at all. It was an open hand, held out by someone with every reason and every ability to close it into a fist instead, and it turned out, in the end, that an entire galaxy of careful, patient calculation had never once accounted for what happens when the door is simply left open, and somebody, eventually, decides to walk through it and find out it was never locked at all.